Welcome to the videos for today's session. We're looking at the medieval church and its theology. Hopefully you've begun already by downloading the chapter about the conversion of England and having a read and think about that. In the following three videos we're going to look at the medieval church, power and the state. That's this video. In the next one we're going to be looking at medieval theology and some intellectual developments. And in the final of the three videos we'll look at monasticism, mysticism, heresy, and actually what happened in your average parish church. Will finish down on the ground. I hope you enjoy this series. Let's begin by looking at the question of the medieval church, power and the state. Well, in 2005, a rumour began to circulate that Pope Benedict's red shoes were being made for him by Prada. Well, the subtext was, of course, a critique of papal luxury, and behind this, an unspoken qualm about the relationship between the sacred and the secular, holiness and money, the church and the state. We tend to think that the church is a different kind of thing to the state. A state is a worldly, political thing. The church is surely something different. However, that division between the two is a profoundly Reformation idea, stemming from Martin Luther's view that there are two kingdoms, a worldly kingdom ruled by princes and a spiritual kingdom of the faithful. But for much of the Middle Ages, this strict differentiation of two kingdoms was not the case. On the contrary, there was a long history of contest over worldly power between the Pope and their representatives, the bishops, on the one hand, and local kings and their lords on the other. And this is going to be the topic of this part of the session. We're going to start with looking at the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West. Already, by the time of Constantine in the 4th century, there was a tendency for the empire to focus on its more prosperous east, the Greek cultured part of the Mediterranean. Hence Constantine's foundation of a new capital at Constantinople, or Byzantium. The Roman Empire lingered on in the west, but from the 5th century it was dogged by a succession of barbarian invasions. Here's what it looked like by the early 6th century. Bishops in Rome had to come to an understanding with all of these new kingdoms and their rulers. Despite the collapse of an empire in the west, in the long term the Roman bishops actually grew in power because of it. We'll be learning more on our study day about how much of the theological running was made in the 3rd and 4th centuries by bishops from Alexandria, Jerusalem and Antioch as they decided how to articulate Trinitarian and Christological ideas. At the time, the Bishop of Rome was really only a relatively small fry compared to those great bishops. The Bishop of Rome really only begins to play a major role in the issues of the church from the Council of Chalcedon in 451. The early Christian balance of power among all these different bishops was radically altered, though, with the rise of Islam, that radically monotheistic faith which swept around the Mediterranean rim. From the death of Muhammad in 632, the Muslim armies swept around the former Roman Empire, reaching their high point in the west at a battle near Poitiers in France in 750. Ironically, the Muslim dominance of the old Roman Empire benefited Rome because it fractured the old Christian power bases in the east. Rome was left as the only rival to the Church of Constantinople, the capital of what was left of the Roman Empire, later the Byzantine Empire. And that empire was henceforth mainly concerned with managing the Muslim threat. I shan't rehearse the full history of the emerging nation states in the Western Europe, but I'll offer you here a thumbnail sketch. Among the barbarians in the West, one particular group, originally Northern French, emerged: the Franks. They conquered rival tribes and reached their apogee under a man called Charles the Great, also known as Charlemagne. Having seen off the encroachment of Islam, the Carolingian Empire covered much of the former Western Empire of Rome. Charles and his successors were keen to take on the mantle of the old Roman ethos. Indeed, Charles had himself crowned by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day in Rome in 800, beginning an institution that would later style itself the Holy Roman Empire, famously not holy, not really Roman, and due to its constant fracturing and election of a king, not really an empire, but still. The Carolingian version of this empire, though, soon broke apart after Charles's death in 814, and it was split amongst his children, with the former territories encroached upon by a new wave of invasions from the north, the Northmen, or Normans as we call them, in northern France. But this vision of a central united Western European state remained, and was picked up and reenacted by a later Germanic king, Otto I, who had himself crowned by Pope John XII in Rome in 962. Otto established a new Holy Roman Empire, an institution that would continue in some form or another until the time of Napoleon. Well, as these new secular powers emerged, including the new smaller peripheral kingdoms like England, the papacy had to develop a working relationship with these secular lords. And on a small scale, we can see this happening when, as the Northumbrian monk Bede records in his ecclesiastical history, popes sent token gifts to the Anglo-Saxon kings to encourage them to support Augustine of Canterbury's missionary work. At a much higher level, the currying of good relations focuses on popes offering to crown monarchs. In return for the Church recognising Charlemagne, for example, as God's choice, the Carolingian Empire in turn sponsored missions across formerly pagan Saxon lands in the east. Carolingian authorities enforced the role of the Church. They patronised monasteries. They listened to clergy for advice. Indeed, as part of the deal of recognising the Carolingian dynasty, the Church of Rome was even granted land in Italy. This became the foundation of what are called the Papal States, which survived in Italy right up until the foundation of the modern Italian state in the 19th century. All of this relationship between the papacy and local kings assumed that the Church had some kind of legitimate power over secular rulers. And this idea was most famously expressed in a document that the bishops of Rome claimed that the Emperor Constantine had authored when he moved his capital from Rome to Constantinople. This document is called the Donation of Constantine. In fact, the document's a forgery, probably created just a little bit before Charlemagne's coronation in 800. The Donation of Constantine shows us the intellectual manoeuvring of the Roman clergy as they prepared to engage with the West's new secular ruler, Charlemagne. The document was only unmasked as a fake just before the Reformation by, it is fair to say, Catholics themselves rather than Protestants. I'd like to invite you to pause this little video and to read now the Donation of Constantine and examine its claims that the medieval papacy was making. Well, so much for rhetoric. But where actually do the boundaries lie between any church and any particular given state? Well, matters are rather complicated by geography. We tend to think of nation states as bounded, solid entities. That's probably because we happen to live on an island. But in the Middle Ages, it's more useful to think of kingdoms as being like Swiss cheeses. They include pockets of land that are in fact owned not by the state, but by the church. So think of a map of Oxford. Each little Oxford college was a tiny independent entity of separate from the crown. Outside of the cities, the church owned pockets of farmland. Now ask yourself, can a local king tax what was grown on church farmland? Add to this another question. To which legal courts do those who work on church lands report to? The King's Court or church courts? Because as it happened, the church had its own independent judicial system, which imposed far more lenient punishments than the king. Church courts in particular did not practice the death penalty, and of course any fines that were taken to a church court would go towards the church, not the king. To be qualified to be tried in a church court instead of a royal court, all you had to do was to claim benefit of clergy. Now, in the Middle Ages there were many levels of clergy below priest and deacon. In fact, just to attend university, men entered minor orders. This would have included them having their hair tonsured like a monk. So even students could claim benefit of clergy. In practice from the 12th century onwards, all you had to do to prove that you should be tried in a church court was that you could read from the Latin Bible, and so you could escape royal justice. Imagine the infuriation this caused kings when a crime was committed on royal lands, but by someone who claimed to be ordained. The king could not punish them. We can just about see the tail end of this issue in clergy sex abuse stories to this day. Is it the Vatican's job to prosecute a priestly sex offender and lock them up in Rome, for there is a Vatican prison, or should such an offender be handed over and tried by the local secular courts? Well, similar to these financial and judicial questions, there is also a political one, and it's the most tricky question of all. Who actually appoints the bishops who oversee the running of all this land and all these church courts? Is it the king's job to nominate a bishop who is then afterwards ratified by a pope? Or does the Pope appoint whoever he wants without consulting the king? Or is there some kind of pragmatic compromise? As you can imagine, kings were understandably nervous about the freedom of bishops. Bear in mind that the bishop was likely to play a major power broker role in any kingdom. Bishops would often be large landowners in their own right. They were often related to other secular lords, and bishops played a major advisory role in the royal court. Indeed, the most senior bishops would crown kings, or conversely, they had the power to declare a king illegitimate. No king would wish to be entirely powerless before such figures. One way in which these church-state fault lines came to a head was in the 11th and 12th century investiture controversy. This focused on a symbolic ritual, the vesting of the bishop with his staff of office and his episcopal ring. In a society where gift-giving indicated lordship, whoever gave these gifts, these signs of office to the bishop, was implicitly the bishop's senior. So, should it be the king who vested the bishop, or only the pope? A reforming pope, Pope Gregory VII, in 1073, strongly asserted against the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV that only the pope or his local representative could vest a new bishop with his signs of office. Henry disagreed. The pope excommunicated him, declared him no longer emperor, and released all Henry's subjects from any oaths that they had made for him. Utter chaos. Henry tried to fight back, trying unsuccessfully to delegitimize Gregory and split the German bishops away from him. In the end, it took 50 years before a resolution was hammered out between the Holy Roman Empire and the papacy at the Concordat of Worms in 1122. And this resolution was that the bishops should indeed only be elected, chosen by the church, but the emperor could decide which one should be appointed if there was a contest, if there were two rivals. Then, afterwards, parallel investitures should take place. The king was allowed to grant the bishop symbolic office over those lands and offices which the bishop had as a secular lord, which had been given to him by the crown, but the signs of spiritual authority over church lands could only be given by the Pope, the staff and the ring. There's an old joke: how do porcupines mate? Carefully. And so it is with church and state. The investiture crisis was just one example of the ongoing question of how these rival power bases should come to an agreement, how church and state should sit together. Indeed, it's a live issue to this day in China. For half a century, the papacy has been in dispute with the Chinese government about the appointment of bishops. I'll add one other detail here. It's not only the papacy jealously guarding its right against the encroachment of kings, the papacy was also wary of the bishops themselves. And so at the same time as the investiture crisis, the papacy began to attempt to enforce clerical celibacy, lest bishops have children and try to pass their lands and their offices on to their sons. In the matter of a conflict between church and state, the medieval example that most of us will be most familiar with occurred in the later 12th century in England, and it involved King Henry II and Thomas Becket. Henry had assumed that Thomas, who was a close friend and a political ally, and whom earlier had been appointed Chancellor of England, would be a soft touch once he became Archbishop. He was ordained in 1162, priest one day, Archbishop the next, and soon after, completely unexpectedly, Thomas began to enforce a strict demarcation between church and state power. Henry tried to impose on Thomas a set of constitutions at Clarendon in 1164, and I'd like you to pause the video and have a look at the handout and have a read of them. Maybe ask yourself, what do you think Henry was driving at? What did he want? And why might Thomas have objected? Of course, Thomas did indeed refuse to sign the constitutions of Clarendon. He preferred exile for a while, and ultimately, even after his reinstatement, his stubbornness would lead to his execution by 3 knights, who legendarily responded to Henry II's exasperated cry, "Who will rid me of this troublesome priest?" Thomas was to become a major symbol for church authority over kings, and he became England's premier saint. So much of a threat was he that even in death, Thomas's cult was vigorously suppressed by King Henry VIII during his break with Rome, lest Thomas inspire others to oppose the king. The form of modus vivendi that had to be worked out between churches and states is nicely reflected in a passage from Pope Innocent III, written in 1198. Again, have a look at your sheet. It's called The Sun and the Moon, and I'll read it. "The Creator of the universe set up 2 great luminaries in the firmament of heaven, the greater light to rule the day, in other words the sun, and the lesser to rule the night, the moon. In the same way, God appointed great dignitaries, the greater to rule over souls, these being as it were days, and the lesser to rule over bodies, these being as it were nights. These dignitaries are the pontifical authority and the royal power. Furthermore, the moon derives her light from the sun, and is in truth inferior to the sun. In the same way, royal power derives its dignity from pontifical authority." It's quite clear there who Innocent thinks is in charge. The height of church-state power confrontation occurred in the 14th century, and the papacy overplayed its hand. In 1302, amidst a contest with Philip IV of France, Pope Boniface VIII decreed, I quote, "It is necessary to salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff." Well, under French orders, Boniface was beaten up and then later died. The papacy then passed to a series of popes elected by powerful French clerics, and between 1309 and 1376 the papacy was moved out of Rome to Avignon in southern France, the so-called Babylonian captivity. The politicization of the papacy led between 1378 and 1417 to the Western Schism, during which there were contested elections by various rival candidates and their country supporters. A series of anti-popes representing conflicting national interests mutually excommunicated each other. At the same time, the papacy was increasingly succumbing itself to the trappings of secular power, adopting the culture of the courts at the time. And all of this was scandal and meat to Christian protests. These protest movements often focused on prominent critics who advocated a return to church purity, giving power back to lay authorities, arguing that scriptures should be translated into the native tongue to reduce the power of clergy. We see in England, therefore, a group called the Lollards, taking up the radical reforming ideas of an Oxford theologian, John Wycliffe, who died in 1384. Wycliffe produced the first English Bible. On the continent, the Hussites picked up the ideas of the Czech theologian Jan Hus, who was executed in 1415. Now, later Protestants would often trace their heritage back to these early reformers, but quite how much Wycliffe or Hus would have agreed with Luther is much to be debated. And there were, of course, even reforming voices within the Catholic Church, like the early 16th century Dutch humanist scholar Erasmus. He could see the problems of corruption and advocated internal reform. So part of the way that we could understand the Reformation is by taking a long view. By the end of the medieval period, resentment towards the power of the Church by secular rulers did substantially help Martin Luther's ideas spread. The German nobility recognised in Luther's ideas about the separation of secular and sacred power, his doctrine of the two kingdoms, a way to relativise and control the Church. And so too did Henry VIII. When the Spanish-dominated papacy refused to grant Henry a divorce, and despite earlier authoring a tract against Luther that earned him the title of Defender of the Faith, Henry suddenly found it convenient to promote Lutheranism and those in court who supported him. And if we bring it down to a very local level, Henry's ability to liquidate the monasteries must have been based on substantial local jealousy and resentment towards what were probably extremely powerful and unaccountable institutions.